I'm Bryce Miller, and this is Talking Atlas. Hello everyone, and welcome back to Talking Atlas. Before we get into today's main event, that is Guilds of Ravnica Spoilers Part 1, a public service announcement. Chances are that you have heard of friend of the show, Titus Lunter, who is a wonderful magic artist and a pretty wonderful person to boot. You may also know that Titus, along with two other magic artists, Magali Villeneuve and Anna Steinbauer, were recently detained by the U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also referred to as ICE. Titus recently put up a Kickstarter for some of his Guilds of Ravnica work, and I highly encourage you to go support him there. Now, admittedly, I would be encouraging you to support Titus if he hadn't been detained by ICE, but especially because that sucky situation happened, you should super go support him. Maybe support him like twice, or still once if that's within your means, but do it like more enthusiastically. Use more exclamation points, something like that. And Titus, if you happen to be listening, glad you got home safe. Frustration with US immigration aside, let's move on to Guilds of Ravnica spoilers. Ravnica is a setting with a special place in a lot of people's hearts, including my own. As a direct consequence of there having been two previous Ravnica blocks, there's been a lot of opportunity for people to fall in love with Ravnica. Plus, it is a setting that is so quintessentially magic. It covers the fantasy elements, the what is sometimes referred to as mage punk elements. It has a ton of history and characters on it, and it has a lot of characters central to the story that are involved with it, like Jason Gideon. I myself started playing Magic around Return to Ravnica, so understandably, I have a degree of, if not nostalgia, at least positive feelings towards the setting. This time around, we're in for a slightly different ride as compared to Return to Ravnica. We are getting what amounts to a Ravnica block, despite blocks not technically existing anymore. This set, Guilds of Ravnica, is being released in September and includes 5 guilds: Boros, Golgari, Selesnya, Dimir, and Izzet. Quick rundown. The Boros are white-red, the Selesnya are green-white, the Golgari are black-green, the Dimir are blue-black, and the Izzet are blue-red. In the new year, we'll be getting Ravnica Allegiances, which covers the other 5 guilds. That's Orzhov, black-white, my personal favorite, the Simic, green-blue, the Azorius, white-blue, the Gruul, red-green, and the Rakdos, red-black. Then, sometime before the core set, we expect a third Ravnica set that will not involve any guild structure, but will instead be more focused on culminating the Magic storyline with Nicol Bolas. Altogether, there is a lot of hype and a lot to deliver on because we are returning to a beloved setting, again, some refer to this as Return to Ravnica, as well as bringing to a close a storyline that has actively spanned 3 to 4 years and passively spanned a lot more than that. There's a lot going on, and so far, signs are promising, I would say. To begin with, let's discuss, as we often do, the mechanics of Guilds of Ravnica. In line with our previous Ravnica blocks, each guild has a mechanic associated with it. For the Boros, we have Mentor. Mentor is a keyword on creatures that says, whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. I am of a split mind on Mentor. On one hand, with the Boros Legion, that is their full name by the way, the Boros Legion, being an army / the police force, it's really hard for them to not have a combat-centric mechanic. And that's fine. This mechanic actually does a really good job of giving us a different perspective on what the Boros usually do. Their first mechanic, Radiance, was kind of weird and didn't make any sense with a police force or army, because it spread effects around based upon the color of the creatures you targeted. Battalion in Return to Ravnica block did a much better job, and it was simply, when you attack with 3 or more creatures, you do a thing. From a high-level perspective, I really want the red-white color combination to have fewer combat-centric mechanics, because almost every mechanic it has is combat-centric. That being said, with my previous caveat that the Boros kinda need to care about combat by their flavor, Mentor is a nice mechanic, because whereas Battalion was about straight-up fighting people, Mentor establishes that we are fighting together, but there is some amount of community involved here. And there certainly is a fraternal element of the Boros, and I mean fraternal in the sense that you talk about a fraternal order of police, not like frat bros. Though I can absolutely imagine some Boros soldiers being like, "Oh yeah, you go, you three guys, attack that spy," or something. I don't have a very good idea of frat bros. This may come as a tremendous surprise to all of you Talking Atlas fans out there, but I am not that much of a frat person. Not very fratty. Moving on now to Selesnya. Selesnya has the triumphant return of the Convoke mechanic. Convoke was first created for the Selesnya in original Ravnica block, and was revisited in M15 with a handful of new cards. Convoke is a mechanic on spells that says you may tap creatures as you cast the spell. Each creature you tap reduces the cost of the spell by either a generic mana or 1 mana of the color of the creature you tapped. So if I have a Convoke spell that costs me 1 green-white, I could pay 1 mana of any color, tap a green creature, and tap a white creature, and cast this spell. Convoke really is a slam dunk mechanic. It has so many uses. You can put it on any card type, really. It plays well into the token strategies that are often prominent in green-white. In fact, for original Ravnica and Return to Ravnica block, the Selesnya were very, very token-focused. They made a lot of Saproings in original Ravnica block, and their mechanic in Return to Ravnica was Populate, which let you copy your tokens. On top of that, Convoke is a very powerful mechanic. We see time and time again that some of the most standout mechanics are things that help you reduce cost. See Affinity for Artifacts, for example. And Convoke is kind of a lower key affinity in the flexibility of its cost reduction. Further, Convoke is more useful to more decks. Affinity for Artifacts is a very powerful cost reduction mechanic, but you kind of need to play artifacts. On the flip side, almost every deck plays creatures. Let's touch on the Golgari next. The Golgari being the guild that occupies the Undercity and has dealings in corpses and fungus, sometimes both at the same time. They are generally a graveyard mechanic-focused guild. The trend continues for Guilds of Ravnica. The Golgari mechanic is called Undergrowth. Undergrowth is an ability word, meaning that it doesn't have any actual rules meaning, but all cards that state that they are Undergrowth related care about the number of creature cards in your graveyard. Altogether, a pretty straightforward mechanic. It plays very well with the Dimir mechanic in this set that we'll get to in a moment. Altogether, a fairly straightforward mechanic, but no less flavorful and no less functional, I imagine. I'm sure I'm not the only person excited by the Dimir's mechanic, Surveil. Surveil is more or less a graveyardy version of Scry. A card will tell you to surveil X, some number, which means that you look at the top X cards of your library, put any number of them into your graveyard, and then the rest on the top of your library in any order. The Dimir have had perhaps the most troubled history of mechanics in Ravnica blocks. In original Ravnica, they had Transmute, which was an activated ability of a card in your hand that allowed you to discard it and search your library for a card with the same converted mana cost. It's a reasonably powerful or flexible mechanic, but it doesn't make a great deal of sense with the Dimir. Their secondary mechanic, and one that appears very frequently in blue-black contexts outside of Ravnica, is the idea of mill, that is, putting cards from a player's library into their graveyard, focusing usually on the alternate win condition of if your opponent draws and they have no cards left in library, they lose. In Return to Ravnica block, they were similarly underwhelming and had a similar focus on mill. For a large chunk of their development, they had a mechanic that is referred to as grind, and grind still appears on a number of Return to Ravnica cards, but not with any ability word or keyword. The idea of grind is that a player will mill cards, put cards from the top of their library into their graveyard until they hit a land. The actual named mechanic for the Dimir in Return to Ravnica block was Cipher, which is a weird go-between of instant/sorceries and almost auras. When you cast an instant or sorcery with Cipher, and it can only be on those two cards, you had the option to exile it, quote-unquote, encoded to a creature you control. When the encoded creature dealt combat damage to a player, you got to recast the encoded spell. It's a cool mechanic. It's a little bit weird to understand. It encourages repetitive gameplay, which is not usually what you want out of a mechanic, and I guess it was a flavor win because it at least gave you the idea of evasive creatures, and the Dimir are people who operate mysteriously behind the scenes and they hit you in unexpected ways, but still only partially on base. The Dimir's latest mechanic has nothing to do with milling your opponents, which is frankly wonderful because we've had enough of blue-black cards milling your opponents. Another theme of Surveil that we may see in some of the cards that we get is that there are plenty of them that say, when you Surveil, do a thing. Maybe you Surveil better. Maybe you get an additional effect when you Surveil. It's a little bit parasitic, that is, it's particular to cards that use Surveil, so it doesn't have much use outside of this set, but it's still interesting and could serve as a deck sub-theme. Or maybe main theme, especially considering what the guild leader for the Dimir looks like, which I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Let me give you our last mechanic first. Our last mechanic first. That's a weird phrase. Our final mechanic is Jumpstart with the Izzet League. Jumpstart is only found on instants and sorceries, and it says that if a spell with Jumpstart is in your graveyard, you may pay all of its costs and discard a card to recast that spell from your graveyard and then exile it. Sort of like Flashback, but with a little bit of additional cost. Blue-red is characteristically the color combo that cares most about instants and sorceries, and indeed for all of their time, the Izzet have done as such. And really, all of their mechanics have been pretty on point, and I'm pleased with what Jumpstart can do. There is one more mechanic, I will say, with a modicum of confidence, in Guilds of Ravnica set that I really want to talk about. Chances are that most other people don't care especially much, but I care a whole heck of a lot. In original Ravnica block, to improve our access to multicolors, we had a cycle of 2-color lands that all had the subtype Gate. For example, Boros Guildgate is a land of subtype Gate. It enters the battlefield tapped, and it taps for red or white. Fairly simple concept, not all that different from most dual lands. Honestly, pretty bad as far as most dual lands go. The concept, though, was that there would be cards that cared about gates, and realistically, this was only kind of followed through on. Maybe the most standout card in my mind that cares about gates is the land Maze's End from Dragon's Maze. It enters the battlefield tapped, it taps for colorless, and has 3 tap, return Maze's End to its owner's hand, search your library for a gate card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle your library. If you control 10 or more gates with different names, you win the game. It doesn't come up quite as often as my love for janky decks or toolboxes, but there is definitely a nice, warm, fond space in my heart for alternate win conditions. Even though I am perfectly willing to admit that Maze's End is a bad TM card. I was caught entirely off guard when I learned that Guilds of Ravnica has gate themes, which further gives me hope that maybe Ravnica Allegiances will also have gate themes, but even if it doesn't, I will be very pleased to have gotten these few Gates Matters cards. An example of one is Guild Summit. 2 and a blue for an enchantment. When Guild Summit enters the battlefield, you may tap any number of untapped gates you control. Draw a card for each gate tapped this way. Whenever a gate enters the battlefield under your control, draw a card. Going along with this return of gate theming, we have new art in 2 versions for each guild gate. One art is meant to be the front door, kind of, the most prominent entrance to a guild's territory, while the other art is a back door, more where people would move in and out when they are making shady dealings. And with Nicol Bolas's nefariating, which isn't a verb, but I'm making it one, on Ravnica, you can imagine that there are a lot of shady dealings going on. I say entirely unironically that maybe one of the most exciting gate cards here is Gateway Plaza. It's a land, subtype gate, enters the battlefield tapped. When it enters the battlefield, sacrifice it unless you pay 1, tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And not to your mana pool because that's no longer on cards, but I am still so conditioned to say it. Wow. This is only marginally better than Transguild Promenade and Rupture Spire before it, but it's a gate! It's an 11th gate! That means that I have a slightly better chance of naturally drawing into gates to win the game with Maze's End. Who out there cares? Probably 10 other people. But I care. Equally, I am excited about Detour. 3 and a green for a sorcery, search your library for up to 2 basic lands and or gates, and put them onto the battlefield. That's a tremendous accelerant for my gate strategy. Oh, I can't wait to update my gate deck. I say again, unironically, I love this mechanic. I don't know why, but it's so good to me. Let us return to the land of things that more people other than me care about, with some of the legendary creatures in Guilds of Ravnica spoiled thus far. I'll start on the Boros because I kind of need to get my disappointment out. I'll try to make it brief. The Boros guild leader is Aurelia, Exemplar of Justice. 2 red-white for a 2/5 legendary creature, Angel. She has Flying and Mentor. As a reminder, Mentor is, whenever this creature attacks, put a +1/+1 counter on target attacking creature with lesser power. Then, at the beginning of combat on your turn, choose up to 1 target creature you control. Until end of turn, that creature gets +2/+0, gains Trample if it's red, and gains Vigilance if it's white. My feelings on this Aurelia are largely the same as my feelings on Mentor that I described mere moments ago. As a creature, she's fine. If you have nothing else on your board, she is a 4/5 Vigilance Trample flyer for 4 mana. That's good. That's pretty good. Maybe even constructed playable good. But gosh, she does the same thing that 9 out of 10 other Boros commanders do. The only way I can conceive of that this card could have gotten around that would be to care about +1/+1 counters rather than caring about combat directly. Because at least then you could have a maybe combat-centric +1/+1 counter deck instead of a Mentor deck or a turn your red-white creatures sideways deck. Moving on to Selesnya. The guild leader is Trostani Discordant. 3 green-white for a 1/4 legendary creature Dryad. Other creatures you control get +1/+1. When Trostani Discordant enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. And at the beginning of your end step, each player gains control of all creatures they own. I'm definitely interested to learn from a story perspective what Trostani is doing in this Ravnica block. With the Selesnya being the weird hippie cult that they are, I could entirely see Trostani being manipulated by Nicol Bolas. In fact, she was quite well manipulated by Lazav in Return to Ravnica block. Lazav being the current leader of the Dimir and a shapeshifter. Mechanically, this card seems fine, nothing really to write home about. Like Aurelia, she seems constructed playable. She makes you 5 power and 8 toughness worth of creatures, and 4 power has lifelink. Her final line of text, what I would go as far to call trinket text, intrigues me, that each player gains control of all creatures they own. It makes me think that that is a top-down design choice, indicating that Trostani may in some way help reveal who traders are or help return people who have been otherwise controlled. And as we all know, Nicol Bolas is a huge fan of exerting his influence on other people. Both the Izzet and the Golgari have a curious situation going on here. Story-wise, both of them are now being led by Planeswalkers, the Izzet by Ral Zarek, and the Golgari by Vraska. We have seen both of their cards for this set, and we have also seen one other legendary creature in their guild, or aligned with those colors. And what that leads me to guess is that while other guilds will give us kind of a leader and a champion that are both creatures, that Golgari and Izzet instead have a leader that is a planeswalker and a champion, quote-unquote. Our Vraska card for this set is Vraska Golgari Queen. 2 black-green for a legendary planeswalker Vraska. She enters with 4 loyalty counters. +2, you may sacrifice another permanent. If you do, you gain 1 life and draw a card. -3, destroy target non-land permanent with converted mana cost 3 or less. And -9, you get an emblem with, whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, that player loses the game. As has been pointed out before on Reddit, there's a lovely, perhaps intentional, flavorful interaction here. At the end of Ixalan block, Vraska and Jace, after becoming best buds during their time sailing on the Belligerent, determined that the only way that Vraska could safely evade Nicol Bolas and keep Jace safe was if she didn't have any memories of what she was doing on Ixalan, except that she got the Immortal Sun and everything was fine, and she never encountered other planeswalkers. This resulted in the card Induced Amnesia, which makes you exile your hand and draw a new one, but when it goes into your graveyard, you get the exiled hand back. From a flavor standpoint, returning the memories. So, it is perhaps fitting that this Vraska can engineer the return of her memories. The Golgari creature is Izoni, Thousand-Eyed. 2 black, green, for a 2/3 legendary creature, Elf Shaman. They have Undergrowth. When Izoni, Thousand-Eyed enters the battlefield, create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token for each creature card in your graveyard. Black-green, sacrifice another creature, you gain 1 life and draw a card. In some ways, this feels frustratingly like what Ishkana, the spider commander from Shadows over Innistrad block, could have been. You have token generation, but much more efficient than Ishkana can do, and card advantage plus life gain, which is pretty fine. Much better than the overcosted drain your opponents for life ability. Also, I realized that I neglected to talk about the other Selesnya legendary creature, Imara, Soul of the Accord, and she is thankfully so much better than the last Imara. Fun fact, the last Imara, Imara Tandris, had her slot swapped with Voice of Resurgence. Voice of Resurgence, you may know, is a card that is absolutely powerful and playable in Modern. Imara Tandris is not even really playable in Commander. I can't recommend her for any deck. If you like her, then yeah, go build with her, that's fine. But she is so bad. This Imara, though, is fine. Imara Soul of the Accord is green-white for a 2/2 legendary creature Elf Cleric. When she becomes tapped, create a 1/1 white soldier creature token with lifelink. It's a lovely way of playing with the Convoke mechanic without having to call out Convoke by name. Further, she generates you more dudes to Convoke with. Another fun deck you could certainly build with this Imara is Vehicles, because in order to crew vehicles, you must tap creatures. And crewing her actively makes your future crewing easier, which is kind of fun. I currently have a Narset Vehicles deck, which is great because Narset can free cast all of my vehicles, but I'm definitely going to ask myself, and probably also contemplate, because I need to do more than just ask, whether I would want to make it green-white vehicles in place of blue-red-white vehicles. Going back over to the Izzet, we have Ral, Izzet Viceroy, which is just a great position title. 3 blue-red for a legendary planeswalker. Ral enters with 5 loyalty counters. +1, look at the top 2 cards of your library. Put one of them into your hand and the other into your graveyard. -3, Ral, Izzet Viceroy, deals damage to target creature equal to the total number of instant and sorcery cards you own in exile and in your graveyard. Both the +1 and the -3 are a fantastic way to play with the Jumpstart mechanic. Very rarely do we see something care about cards in exile, but it makes a lot of sense for Spellslingers, since even outside of this set, you do a lot of casting instants and sorceries from your graveyard, be it by flashback, maybe by retrace, and other methods still. Finally, -8, you get an emblem with, whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, this emblem deals 4 damage to any target, and you draw 2 cards. Then we have the ousted leader of the Izzet, Niv-Mizzet, Paran. In Ravnica speak, a Paran is the founder of a guild. If you hadn't guessed, Niv-Mizzet did name the Izzet after himself. It seems like every other thing in the Izzet League sounds kind of like Niv-Mizzet or rhymes in some way. There's Mizzix of the Is Magnus. It gets kind of confusing sometimes. This Niv-Mizzet is blue, red, for a 5/5 legendary creature Dragon Wizard. The spell can't be countered. Flying. Whenever you draw a card, Niv-Mizzet Paran deals 1 damage to any target. Whenever a player casts an instant or sorcery spell, you draw a card. This seems on par, if not more powerful, than the traditionally more powerful of the 2 previous Niv-Mizzets, Niv-Mizzet the Firemind. who is well reputed as a tremendous combo engine. There's a similar idea where, with one or two other steps, Izzet the Firemind can deal damage to players when you draw cards, which means if you enchant him with something like Curiosity, which says that when he deals damage, you draw a card, then you can generally machine gun down one or more players so long as you have cards to draw from your library. This Izzet can do all the same things, but with an added bonus of actually caring about instants and sorceries, which is, I think, the first time a Izzet has done that. Odd considering how much the Izzet care about their instants and sorceries. And finally, for our legends, we have the slam dunk of a Dimir guild leader, Lazav the Multifarious. In case you weren't sure, like I wasn't, Multifarious, actually a word. Many and of various types, or having many varied parts or aspects. This Lazav is blue-black for a 1/3 legendary creature shapeshifter. When Lazav enters the battlefield, surveil 1. So you look at the top card of your library, and you may choose to put it into your graveyard. He has an activated ability for X. Lazav the Multifarious becomes a copy of target creature card in your graveyard with converted mana cost X, except its name is Lazav the Multifarious, it's legendary in addition to its other types, and it has this ability. The previous Lazav had a similar idea where he could copy a creature when it was put into a graveyard. I'm digging the self-mill aspect of this deck, perhaps obvious, because it does work with Surveil very well, but again, it's an aspect of Dimir that tends not to be visited. There are countless Dimir commanders that encourage or straight up function with milling your opponents. Finally, we have one that cares about you milling yourself, and does it in a really unique, flexible, and maybe powerful way. You can at instant speed give Lazav hexproof or unblockable or infect, and all of these things are really, really scary. Next, we'll run card by card through some cards in this set that catch my eye. We'll be moving roughly chronologically from the start of spoiler season. First, this Return to Ravnica is also Return of the Shocklands. The Shocklands are a cycle of dual lands first seen in original Ravnica block, hence the Return to. They all have 2 basic land types, which means they can tap for one or the other color, and they enter the battlefield tapped unless you pay 2 life. The shock aspect of the nickname coming from the idea of 2 life / damage. Shocklands are a critical component of probably 80% of modern mana bases, because they are easily fetchable by fetch lands. The fetch lands all have tap, sacrifice them, pay 1 life, search your library for a blank or a blank, where those blanks are basic land types, put that onto the battlefield and shuffle your library. Another cool thing about Shocklands is that they have remained remarkably steady in price since Return to Ravnica block. They are consistently in the $8 to $12 range. Maybe some of them creeped a little bit outside of that recently, but I am fully expecting that price of Shocklands will decrease dramatically, which will be a huge boon to Modern. Now, the flip side is that sometimes the availability of lands to a format like Modern can actually have a pronounced effect on other cards in the format. I believe something of this nature happened when the allied fetch lands were printed into Modern with Khans of Tarkir. Because these lands are so central to Modern, they are often one of the financial barriers to entry for the format. For example, I am playing my Esper Spirits deck in Modern right now. To fill that out with fetch lands and shock lands by their current prices is ballpark probably $200, maybe $150 worth of lands. And that's nothing to sneeze at for any leisure hobby, Magic included. But if across the board the price of lands decreases, and if this wasn't a deck that I already had, I would be incentivized to get into Modern. That can force other prominent staple prices to rise. Now, I am in a good position personally, because having this deck means that I have the deck, and all I need to do is get cheaper lands, hopefully. If you haven't built a Modern deck, there is a small risk, not a huge one, but a small one, that other cards in the deck will increase in price. So, keep an eye out for that if you're thinking of getting into Modern. Before you do or don't, though, probably get a second opinion, because I am by no means an expert. We have a fun, quote-unquote reprint next. It's Narcomoeba. 1 in a blue, for a 1/1 creature illusion. It's a rare. It has flying, and when it is put into your graveyard from your library, you may put it onto the battlefield. Narcomoeba's only previous appearance was as a future-shifted card in the set Future Sight. The idea of these cards were that they were quote-unquote cards from the future! Future. And to this day, not all of them have seen print. This is Narcomoeba's first printing outside of Future Sight. So, technically, if we're going by timeline shenanigans, it is Narcomoeba's first printing, and Future Sight was the second? There is another mechanic in this set that I nearly entirely forgot, and that is split cards. A split card is pretty much, in every sense of the phrase, 2 cards in 1. They are formatted to make 2 mini cards fit onto a Magic card turned sideways. So it's 90 degrees off from the orientation of a Magic card normally. Split cards have also featured in every Ravnica block up to the present. Unlike Dragon's Maze, these split cards do not bring any additional mechanic with them. They simply are a card in your hand that's really 2 cards. You choose to cast one or the other. From what I can glean, this set has 2 cycles, each guild having an uncommon and a rare split card, where the left side costs hybrid mana. That is, you can pay either of 2 colors for all of the mana on it, and the other side is true multicolored. You must pay multiple colors of mana for it. Another element of split cards is that they always have some kind of naming scheme to go along with them. For every split card up to Return to Ravnica block, that was join the 2 words with and. Applying this idea to some of the cards in Dragon's Maze, you had Alive and Well, Armed and Dangerous, Beck and Call, Breaking and Entering, Down and Dirty, Catch and Release, and so forth. Amonkhet block had a different take on split cards with the Aftermath mechanic. The way Aftermath cards worked were that they were 1 card in your hand, but a different card if you wanted to cast them from your graveyard. And for this, you can imagine all the cards as being joined by the word to. Dusk to Dawn, Claim to Fame, Heaven to Earth, Farm to Market, which I always thought was really funny, or Onward to Victory. Finally, by the present day in Guilds of Ravnica, it's really difficult to find appropriate word pairs that you can use the and naming scheme with. So instead for this set, and probably this block, each card on the split card shares the first 3 letters of its name. Examples include Connive and Concoct, Expansion and Explosion, Find and Finality, Invert and Invent, and so forth. To give you an actual example of what one of these cards is, let's talk about Expansion Explosion. Expansion is an instant for blue-red hybrid. It says copy target instant or sorcery spell with converted mana cost 4 or less. You may choose new targets for the copy. Explosion is X blue red for an instant. It deals X damage to any target, and target player draws X cards. This paints a nice contrast to a card from original Ravnica block, Invoke the Firemind. X blue red for a sorcery. Choose one, draw X cards, or Invoke the Firemind deals X damage to target creature or player, which by modern wording would be any target. Explosion, for a single red mana more, does both. So I imagine that for those who are playing Invoke the Firemind, they are going to cease playing Invoke the Firemind. Let's move away from split cards and into what is almost certainly a modern playable card, Assassin's Trophy. Black-green for an instant. Destroy target permanent an opponent controls. Its controller may search their library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then shuffle their library. This effect is somewhat reminiscent of Path to Exile, which is white for an instant that exiles target creature, and then its controller gets a basic land. This being green-black, obviously, it's not quite as flexible, but green-black is historically a decently prominent color combination in Modern, especially when you think about Jund, which is red, black, green. Jund has been beaten back more recently by other sort of mid-rangey decks, but a card like Assassin's Trophy may help it seize control of the metagame a bit more. Also, that flexibility is absurd. This is going to be the ultimate removal for Golgari decks, I would suspect. It can even get rid of problematic lands. 2 mana to blow up a land is pretty okay when it's guaranteed being replaced by only a basic. Oh, I can't counter your spells because you have a Cavern of Souls? Neat. I'll blow it up and you can get a basic. What's that? Your Moorland Haunt is spewing out spirit tokens every turn? Let's get rid of that. Oh no, you're going to combo out and deal lethal damage to me with Valakut? Just kidding, it's a basic mountain now. It is important to note that the land does not enter the battlefield tapped, unlike Path to Exile. Still, seems like a decent card. The card March of the Multitudes is a very funny inclusion for reasons I will explain in just a moment. It is X green white for an instant. It has Convoke, and it creates X 1/1 white soldier creature tokens with lifelink. Let us take another trip back to Return to Ravnica because we haven't done enough of those. In the block, it happened that every guild but the Selesnya had a Mythic X spell. This was not intentional. No one designed that each guild would have a Mythic X spell. It just happened that way. However, the Selesnya did not have one. So I think that March of the Multitudes is an intentional completing of that quote-unquote cycle. Also, wow, I am really saying quote-unquote a lot in this podcast. Why am I quoting so many people? In the category of cards that just seem real good, we have Beast Whisperer. 2 green for a creature elf druid. It's a 2/3 and whenever you cast a creature spell, draw a card. Other cards in this vein include Soul of the Harvest and Primordial Sage. They operate slightly differently in occasionally meaningful ways, but they are generally the same thing. Use your non-token creatures to draw cards. However, both Primordial Sage and Soul of the Harvest are 6 mana and are a little bit beefier in their stats. That said, you don't usually play Soul of the Harvest because you want to hit people. You play Soul of the Harvest because you want card advantage when you have creatures. Which tells me that Beast Whisperer is either going to replace or supplement cards like Primordial Sage and Soul of the Harvest in probably most green, especially mono-green decks. It wouldn't be a Ravnica block if we didn't have some kind of artifact to help you color fix. This time around, it is the Locket cycle, each one being named for its guild, so Boros Locket, Dimir Locket. In original Ravnica block, it was the Signets, which are 2 mana, and then taken 1 mana to generate 2, one of each of its guild's colors. And then in Return to Ravnica, we had the Key Runes at Uncommon, which tapped for 1 mana or the other, and could be activated to become a creature with certain keywords or effects. And then there were also the Clue Stones, which were 3 mana, tapped for 1 color or the other, or you could pay both colors and tap and sacrifice them to draw a card. The Lockets are closest to the Clue Stones in their mechanics. They're 3 mana, they add 1 color or the other, then they have hybrid tap, sacrifice it, draw 2 cards. I do not expect that the Lockets will be anywhere near as ubiquitous as the Signets. Having a turn 2 mana rock is just too good sometimes. That said, I can imagine some decks really wanting to play these. Probably not 3-color decks because that quad hybrid sacrifice cost is a bit steep, but in 2-color decks, this could be fine, especially someone like Boros, where you inevitably have too little card advantage. Another returning cycle is Guild Mages. In the first Ravnica block, the Guild Mages were all creatures that could be cast with hybrid mana and had 2 activated abilities, each using a different color of that guild's mana. In Return to Ravnica, they had 2 abilities, but both abilities cost both colors. And it seems that in this Ravnica block, they all have 2 tap abilities. The naming scheme this time around is to use the second portion of each guild's full name. So there's the Golgari Swarm, the Boros Legion, the Izzet League, and most curiously, House Dimir. So you have House Guildmage, which sounds like, you're Guildmage. Like, are they house trained? Oh no, they got mill everywhere. Many non-multicolored focused sets have multicolored cards at Uncommon that help indicate to you what the draft archetype is like. Now, in a set as heavily multicolored as a Ravnica set is, it's kind of hard to tell which of those are meant to be draft indicators and which are just multicolored Uncommon cards, but there certainly are a very interestingly high quantity of cards that cost CCDD, where C is one guild's color and D is its second. So they're 4 mana, all of it colored. It really makes me wonder if we might be getting the return of the Devotion mechanic in an upcoming set. Devotion counts the number of colored symbols among mana costs of permanents you control. It was seen in Theros, having been adapted from the Chroma mechanic in Lorwyn block. I don't expect we'll be going to Theros after Return to Ravnica block, because we went to Theros after Return to Ravnica block. It's possible, but it seems a little bit unlikely. Let's cover one last card here together today, and it just might be the cutest card in this set. Affectionate Indrik. 5 and a green for a 4/4 creature beast. When it enters the battlefield, you may have it fight target creature you don't control. Flavor text. The problem isn't the Indrik's enthusiasm. It's Ravnica's lack of guardrails. And in the art, the Indrik is nuzzling a person. And like, they're probably going to get knocked off that ledge, but they're just nuzzling someone, and that's really adorable. Alrighty, I think that does it for this first portion of Guilds of Ravnica spoilers. I'm sure we'll have Jacob back next week once he's gotten over the really, really infuriating sore that he apparently has in his mouth. He said that specifically it makes it painful to pronounce B's, P's, and M's, or really any syllable where your lips have to touch together to produce it. We tried for a while avoiding all the cards that had either B's, P's, or M's in the names, flavor text, or rules text. It didn't end up working out, so we decided that he should sit this one out. If you would care to contact me and determine my route to Maze's End, you can find me on Twitter as walking_Atlas, or you can email us at info@opalnebula.com. Jacob can be found anywhere you find someone named Frogger, that's Phrawgger. For more Talking Atlas, find us on iTunes, Google Play, or our website, opalnebula.com. And if you think that we're as cool as we think we are, then you should definitely come join us on our Opal Nebula Discord. A link to this Discord can be found in the description for today's show. Keep your enemies close, and your guilds closer. And until next time, happy planeswalking.